justice is like outside Pakistan. हमारी अपनी जो, we tend to think, if you look at the media in Pakistan, we only talk about ourselves. But to get a sense of how climate justice is playing in places like Turkmenistan, in places like Argentina, in Nepal, is not only enriching but essential for all of us to be able to connect as well. I want to briefly introduce my panel. Sitting immediately to my left is Chung Ah Baek, who is a researcher in the governance cluster at the Institute of Development Studies. Her research focuses on climate resilience and the gendered impacts of climate change. After Chung, we have Samanata Thapa, who is the Asia partner and head of programs at Startup Discovery Asia, where she drives inclusive innovation programs for climate startups across Nepal. After Samanata, we're joined by Reagan Des Vignes, who is a journalist working with TRT World in Istanbul. Reagan is the producer and, journalist, and he's the executive producer of this award-winning climate show called Just 2 Degrees. So we get an international view as well. And we are also joined by Mijael, who is the co-founder and director of Consciente Colectivo, which is a social environmental organization of young people in Argentina. He's one of the elected representatives of the public for the Escazú Agreement, which is the first environment agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he's a lawyer and a teacher as well. We are also joined by Selbi Jumayeva.
Juma, like a Juma prayer.
Forgive me, like the Juma. Who is from Turkmenistan and does a lot of very interesting things. She's on the intersection of social justice movements, art and science. She's a grassroots organizer. She's working on cultural and natural heritage and presently working on desert futures. I'm going to. Right. Let me set the context here for a little bit. This summer, 2 million people in Punjab were affected by floods. In 2022, 30 million people in Pakistan were affected by floods. Very different types of floods. The floods this August were unprecedented in some ways because of repeated western disturbance winds in August. That's very rare. You don't get 17, 18 pulses of western disturbance winds during the monsoon. That's very, very rare. And these western disturbance winds collided with the monsoon, raising the monsoon clouds up so that it rained in Uttarakhand, in Himachal, in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the mountains in KP, which is why we heard of so many cloud bursts, basically destroying villages and taking lives along the way. There are aspects of climate change in this, that unprecedented and unexpected changes in weather patterns. This was one of them. This year, this August, for the first time in recorded history, the monsoon clouds went over the Tibetan plateau and it rained on the other side. That's never happened before. And as Sunita Narayan of the Center of Science and Environment in New Delhi tells us, there is a giant mess in the sky. This mess is caused by climate change. It's caused by the greenhouse gases that have been thrown into the atmosphere by the global north since the Industrial Revolution, making them immensely rich and disproportionately powerful and impoverishing vast parts of the world that we occupy as members of the global south. I have a very interesting panel here because you're going to hear very differing views of what climate change politics are like in other parts of the world. Here in Pakistan, there is no question that there is climate change. But you're going to hear from other panelists about how their politics are different. And yet find yourselves with similarities as well. So for my first round of questions, because we have such a diverse panel over here, I'm going to sort of set it up and request my panelists to please first give a context of the climate impacts in the region that you're working with so that our Pakistani audience knows whether it's flooding or drought or temperatures or crop failures that are of main concern. And then a little bit about your work in that area and focusing on climate justice. Now, I know, Chun, that you work on adaptation, so you could also talk about that as well. So I'll kick off with you, please.
Thank you, Rafi. So before I move so I'm working on Myanmar, but before I move or give the background of the Myanmar in terms of the climate change, I would like to start with the questioning, when we think about the climate justice, what does it mean? So for me, when I think of climate justice, it's about responsibility. I know that responsibility is never simple. I mean, there are many questions that we can raise. For example, what is the responsibility? And responsibility for what? And who holds responsibility for whom? Is it the state for its people, or communities for one another, or the citizens for the environment? But at least we know that when the disaster strikes, we see how unevenly and fragile these responsibilities can be. And it's obvious that responsibilities are left to those with the least resources. So I would like to ask, how can we, thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay. So how can we mitigate the impact, or at least reduce the burden of those most affected in the region? So going back to the context of Myanmar, I think it's quite similar to Pakistan. Myanmar is also experiencing variety of the climate-related events, and more importantly, I don't know whether you know that there is a climate risk index. It just shows the world indicator that the ranking the countries in terms of the level of the impact of climate change. So the Myanmar ranks the fourth, the most climate-affected country between 1993 to 2022. And it had a very high absolute and relative number of fatalities. And then every year, the impacts of climate change, due to the impacts of climate change, the Myanmar loses around 0.9% of its GDP. And more importantly, there was a cyclone in 2008 called the Cyclone Nargis. One of the deadliest cyclones in the past 2 years, was hugely responsible for the country's ranking. It affected almost 2.4 million people and killing 140,000 people. It's and also there is a displacement of 800,000 people. But importantly, this is not depending on data, you can see a slightly difference, but this is more from the UN report. So Cyclone Nargis, I feel, is a good example to see the kind of case in terms of who is responsible for what. So one of the key factor that caused the very fatal damage of that fatalities was there was lack of early warning systems. So on the 28th of April in 2008, the storm formed, and then 29th of April, it already identified as a kind of tropical depression that is turning into a storm-like system with a potential to hit Bangladesh and Myanmar within 4 or 5 days. And interestingly, there was some precautions and shelters were activated in Bangladesh, while there was no such precautions and actions or weather alerts in Myanmar. So all of these, how to prepare for the climate change and how to cope with that impact fell onto the communities. So is the time allowing? Yeah. So I'm just to briefly talk about how the communities respond to this, and then why it is important to have the early warning systems, which is accessible to the local people. So they're in the Irrawaddy Delta, which is the coastal areas, and that's the very low-lying and densely populated region. And people living in the Irrawaddy Delta, they are mostly farmers and fishers, so they tend to be aware of the weather alert. So when there is a storm alert, they do not go to the workplace. But on the 2nd of May, when the Nargis struck, because they didn't know they didn't hear, there was an insufficient weather early warning report, but also when they heard about the weather alert from the radio and television, they didn't know how severe it was. So my interviewees and the people living in there, they just do what they used to do, farming, fishing, going to other towns for selling timbers. So that's why I'm talking about we need to develop the kind of community-based early warning systems, again, which is transferable to the locally accessible language. We do not know, even I don't know, when we heard about, there is a wind storm, wind intensity, the velocity between 18 to 33 miles per hour. Do you know? We don't know. So it's important to have to let the community members to understand what that impact would be to their everyday life. We can think about the trees and branches can be destroyed, or the level of housing. For example, the housing of the light construction could be unroofed, or your small boats might be carried away. So it's important to have that immediate accessible language to the communities. And what was very striking to me, when I visited those villages in the 2019, 11 years later the cyclone, and still the village was very muddy. So they all lost the farmlands, and there is a decrease in fish stock, so they had to move to other towns. And that village, only 20 households were living there, so mostly either over 60 or very young kids. And all the infrastructure development again fell onto them. So there was a lack of support and resources and capacity, and I can talk about a bit later if there are any questions raised. So again, going back to the climate justice, what is the responsibility then? We know that we always talk about structural inequality. We need to kind of require the transformative capacity. But from my point of view, it's very essential, but we all know that it's impossible that this can happen within a day or even in the near future. Then the question will be then how to again distribute those responsibilities and what responsibility would be. Then what my answer could be the responsibility to warn that all the knowledge should reach everyone, and responsibility to protect our safety is a right, not as a privilege, and to include or to prioritize the voices and knowledge. We are not speaking for them, but we need to speak with them. And finally, the responsibility to care, which is resilience, is a shared commitment. And we need to really think about the care as a public good.
Early warning systems and the need for it is crucial, and you're absolutely right. There has to be a way of translating these technical advisories into sensible advice that people can understand, especially people who are living in delta areas and are very, very insecure when it comes to climate change. I want to move on to Samantha, and now you work, Samantha, on sort of technology and innovation in climate change in Nepal. Can you give us a sense of what Nepal is challenged with in climate change and what your work seeks to do using something like technology, and what sort of entrepreneurs are you looking for?
Sure, thank you. To tell you a little about Nepal, we're a small country with global emission less than 0.1. But when it comes to climate vulnerability, we're in the fourth. So we're the fourth most climate vulnerable country. With such little emission that we have, there's a lot that we need to pay up for when it comes to climate adaptation and becoming resilient for perhaps things that we didn't do. With that, to tell you a little context about so climate change for us has now started becoming a lived experience even in the urban parts of our country. For example, we're having, like you mentioned, unprecedented rainfall. Right now, Nepal is closed. Several parts of Nepal is closed for 2 days because we have a heavy monsoon rain that extended, which means that schools are closed, offices are closed for the next 2 days, which was not expected. But compared to last year, where Kathmandu also saw floodings, where this was the first time the urban population of Nepal actually faced climate change and flooding head-on, because it would always be a very distant story of this happened on the way to a certain village. There was a landslide in, 200 kilometers away from Kathmandu, for example. So for the urban elites, it was still a distant story, although it was happening within Nepal. We see wildfires every year, and it's just increased over time. The wildfires that would be managed. So there's a story behind this as well, where every April to May, Kathmandu comes as the most polluted city in the world. Our AQI is terrible. We top the list for not the best reasons, of course. And this is because there are wildfires around Kathmandu Valley. Why does this happen? There's a socio-economic shift that is happening in rural parts of Nepal, where people are no longer collecting fossil fuel because, of course, it's being replaced by LPGs. Community forests are protected. But at the same time, we know that this is going to happen, but our resiliency in terms of how do we stop these wildfires, it's still not discussed. It's still not there out in the policy. There's very little innovation being done around it. So with that, I think that's the context of Nepal. We're also seeing the glacier melt. We see a lot of glacier lake outburst, which is happening, a lot of flash floods that come with it. And it really always mostly affects the rural communities, the smallholder farmers, which make a large percentage of the providers in our country, but we're not equipped with we're not equipped to face climate challenges and adapt to these changes. So with that, I think I'd like to say that for me, climate justice, when we talk about climate justice, it's really about also speaking about, do the climate vulnerable population, especially the youth, women, and marginalized, do they have access to resources such as credit, land, technology, to really face and overcome climate challenges that Nepal is facing or not? And how do we make it accessible to the population which perhaps do not have access to the resources that we're always talking about when it comes to climate change? Are we really preparing them? And how do we ensure that resources are accessible so that they can be prepared in their own ways?
As a proud Lahori, I don't like being told that Lahore is not the most polluted city in the world. Stop taking our records. Fourth most vulnerable. We're the most vulnerable, damn it. But that's your similarity. Air pollution is seriously something that's a serious problem in Kathmandu. And you give me a good sort of transition to Reagan and your reporting, because you talked about climate change, people seeing it for the first time. I often say, Reagan, that climate change is something you see on TV until it happens to you. And as a producer of a climate change show, what vision do you have of climate justice? What do you see unfolding before your very eyes? And why do you do this show?
I've got to tell you, reporting on climate change might be, to me, one of the most depressing things to report on. This is in light of all the conflicts going on around the world. Climate change has obviously taken a backseat to some important issues, even though many organizations would agree that climate crisis is the most existential threat of our time. But it's not an easy one to get behind for several reasons. You look at, for example, Gaza, there's almost an easy definition of what's right and what's wrong, depending on what side you're on. I'm not here to judge. But it's easy to define where you stand and whose side you choose. The climate crisis is so much more complicated because so much of it is balancing where we go from here in terms of making ourselves resilient, getting the technology that we need, protecting communities around the world, and having an economy that grows at the same time. So we're in a situation where right now the wealthy have enough money to transition, but they're not, because governments they owe their financiers after winning the elections. They owe the oil companies, the agriculture companies, some of the most powerful companies in the world. Help them get into power. They owe them. They can't transition the way we want them to transition. And you have poorer nations in the global south, mostly, economically speaking, not geographically, that need coal and gas to catch up to the rest of the world while they transition to renewables. Yet they're being asked by the global north to transition to renewables now. Why aren't things fair? Why were the only ones in the north That why we're the only ones that have to transition? Why don't you have to transition too? Yeah, because you guys got rich off our backs, and now we have to catch up somehow. And it's not fair to ask us to borrow money from you to transition to renewables and then owe you, be beholden to you until for generations to come. So I really don't know what climate justice looks like. It's incredibly complicated. I can easily say, yeah, the wealthy should pay their share and should give money to the poorer nations to transition, but it's so complicated. Everyone's economies are intertwined. I don't see the way out of this. I don't see us focusing on the climate crisis while focusing on the wars in the African continent, while focusing on US hegemony in Latin America, while focusing on these wars and unjust repression of people in the Middle East. How do we focus on all of it? It feels almost designed to keep us distracted from one thing. Reporting on this it just feels like a revolving door of uncertainty, absolute heartbreak. We talk to people all the time who don't know where the next meal is coming from. They just don't know. Their crops are gone. They're not getting money from their government, who is playing politics with the international community just to stay in power. Like, how do we even start addressing climate justice anywhere? I mean, everything that we talk about so far in terms of creating an economy that's just for communities in Myanmar, developing the technology in Global South as recommended in Nepal. I don't know what the other are going to say, but these things are all great. But still, at the end of the day, there are millions of people every day who just don't have bread because of climate shocks.
Yeah.
And they're not getting help anywhere. They're not getting the money they need right now to do anything because all of our attention is placed in the Middle East right now.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything spark an international debate like Gaza. And it's just. It's a justified debate. What's happening there is unjust.
Yeah.
But also, while that's happening, and who knows how long it's going to happen for until Israel gets what it wants. Sorry, all the Israel supporters here. But how long is it going to continue for while we creep slowly to 2.7 by the end of this century?
By the middle of this century. All right, Reagan, that's enough. That is depressing. And my next question to you is how you deal with this, which we'll come to in a second. But I want to turn now to Mijael, because Reagan was talking a lot about the U.S. hegemony, the difficulty of reporting on climate change. Now, I know you work on climate issues, but before I ask you to sort of introduce our audience to what's happening in Argentina, I also want you to introduce your president and what he stands for, and give these guys an idea of what it's like on the other side.
Nightmare. Okay, hello. It's my first time in Pakistan. I am really happy to be here. I must say that my English is not as well as my colleagues, so I will do my best. I hope you understand my comments. I have a lot of questions. I don't know if I have any answers. I am in a moment of my life that I have more questions than answers, and I think more than ever we need to make new and more questions, because if not, we are going to keep doing the same that in the last years. But answering to your question, my first answer is it's quite a nightmare. In terms of climate change, our president in Argentina in Latin America, South America, champions of the world in football. Perhaps you know, we love football, so that's why we love Messi and all the team. Yes, of course. Thank you, Argentina. But talking about the president, our president denies climate change. So imagine how it's the context in terms we are going again in a basic discussion and conversation in terms of, hey, climate change exists. This is not the first time in planet Earth. We have been talking about that yesterday. Perhaps later you can deep into that. But it's the first time that the human being makes all these crises. And in Argentina, our president says, hey, this is a lie from socialists and communists and the left-wing parties. So we are facing that. Of course, that with this context, it's quite difficult to push climate action, to push climate policies, and to have money, budget for these kind of policies in Argentina. We are one of the biggest countries in the region, one of the biggest economies, and this is part of our context. In terms of the impacts of climate change in the region, we are having floods, as here in Pakistan. For example, here in Argentina in March, we have a big flood. Many people die because of that. We have droughts, we have heat waves, we have wildfires, and many other examples we are facing. And also internal migration inside different countries because of climate change. And in terms of some facts and information about the region, we have more than 40% of the world species in terms of biodiversity. So Latin American and Caribbean region is really important in terms of biodiversity, and we need to have this conversation because in terms of climate change, of course, it's important to have this in mind. I know I have to close. I'm gonna be really quick. In Argentina in 2022-2023, we have the worst drought in 60 years, and that affects a lot of our economy because our economy depends a lot in terms of the field and what happens outside the main cities in Argentina. And we are facing this basic conversation of explaining that climate change is a fact that we are facing in Argentina, that thousands of people in March in many cities of the country were forced to leave their houses because of this. And this kind of floods never happened before in Argentina. So imagine our frustration, as our colleague has just said, that we are having this kind of conversation. So basic, so easy, and so stupid in some way. Sorry my word, but I am from Argentina. We speak in this way. I am really worried, and I close with this, that I think we are not having enough conversations inside the Global South. I think these kind of spaces are really important, but I think we need to deep into conversations inside the Global South because we have similar pasts, similar context, and similar problems in terms of poverty, hunger, and many other reasons. We have to deep into examples, solutions, and good examples we have. But we need more than ever to share between us. I close with that.
I appreciate your point on this South-South conversation, and we'll try and get to that later on. But moving on to Selbi, your work in Turkmenistan is fascinating. I really want to know what it means when you work in a desert. But can you give us a context of the country first, and then speak a little bit about what you do?
I'll speak a little bit about what I've done
Oh,
for
could
the
you-
past. Yeah. Okay. Does it work?
Yes.
Great. So for the past quarter of century, for 25 years, I've been part of grassroots organizing all over Central Asia. So while I'm here, I'll try to speak also of other republics and our agendas. There's a multiplicity of agendas, solutions, practices, and issues all over the region. Like, for example, some part of Central Asia, where Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is also called a third pole. So the issue of glaciers is very central there. It's a mountainous region. And if we talk about Kazakhstan, which is the 9th largest country in the world, that has gone through institutionalized famine, the settlement of nomadic peoples, and it has the greatest step, and also been experiencing floods at the moment. And my country is Turkmenistan. It's 80% desert. I think many in Pakistan, when I meet people from Pakistan, it's first time in Pakistan for me, but I meet many people from your country abroad, and the first thing they say, oh, tapi. Like, we can't wait for Turkmen gas. Yeah, so many people from Pakistan usually say, oh, and they mention TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline project. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, so it's exciting that people know that Turkmenistan has 4th largest proven natural gas resources in the world, as well as oil. But at the same time, as you mentioned, my topic is desert futures. So for me, it's like to talk about deserts being this beautiful landscapes, both culturally and naturally. It's biodiverse, and it's important, and it has its place on the planet. Because often, when I come to conversations about climate, people often discuss desert as a problem, or desert as a nightmare. However, for nomadic peoples of Central Asia, for Turkmenistan, including for several people, desert is our reality. And it's a beautiful reality, biodiverse reality. So how do we talk about deserts while discussing anthropogenic climate change? How do we not mention desert as a negative consequence, but rather existing for centuries? And exactly, what our conversation was yesterday, that climate change is a deep time planetary process that shaped life on Earth. And its anthropogenic impact on the climate change, when climate change has been reshaped, the processes due to the human activity in a particular time of century in a particular countries and part of the world, which really this panel mentions that not all nations carry this burden of affecting climate change and changing weather. And so to me, is about desert futures is what kind of lessons and what kind of experiences, practices, including practices of joy, including practices of sustainable living, we can learn from desert peoples, to take with us. And I think it's very similar to the places that know flood as a phenomena, not as a problem, because not everywhere, like in certain communities, people have dealt with floods and dealt with water, and in certain communities, indigenous people dealt with fires. They managed fire in forests, right? So that's why I very much relate to what you were saying, that we hold those technologies. So for me, it's like not talking about my community as vulnerable, but talking about my community as resourceful, and how my communities can bring those solutions, because we have always been living in extreme weather. So extreme weather is a norm. However, at the same time, definitely the anthropogenic climate change has been reshaping our life too. For example, because the standards of living is set in a different way, and we know it's extended our lives, it's improved our health and even opportunities. At the age of 40 right now, as a woman from Turkmenistan, I can sit here and speak to you in a good health. And we often discuss the air. And to my surprise, because I also discuss dust, and dust storms not only as a problem, but also as interplanetary and intercontinental process, as a weather event. And looking at Asia Pacific air pollution index, and looking at the dust storm experiences, actually Turkmenistan full year around, all the days in the year, Turkmenistan is always in the dust at the PM levels that are very high. So to me, while I'm in Turkmenistan, I don't feel it, because we just got used to the dust. But if we speak about, and I think that's also something that we've been living in for centuries. However, with the anthropogenic climate change, just like the sea level rises across the world, in my landlocked country, the planetary dust belt hasn't been increasing. So if you just remember how the planet looks, and if we look at this like yellow line around, so now it's 1/3 of the planet. So just like this is that the dust belt is increasing. So in places like my home, what has been already dry and hot and extremely cold too, because it's actually to run cold deserts. There's like different type of deserts, and so the weather is going to get more extreme. The temperatures will become much higher. It's going to get hotter, drier, dustier. So I think there's still solutions to be found. Not only the technologies we can use to survive in those conditions. So that's what for me is important, that not only lessons learned from people living in deserts, but also that deserts are conserved. Turkmenistan is a very biodiverse place. It's home to the second largest population of Persian leopards, for example, and we have still wild plants that went extinct in other countries across Central Asia, or other desert ecosystems. For example, we have hunting, and in general guns are illegal. So of course, like, the biodiversity is very well protected, Turkmenistan, so we can also bring those lessons along with people, not just lessons from our people, but that our people also thrive in future.
Thank you for that. I don't know how many, thank you so much for that. Because we live in a land of rivers, we don't know what it's like to live in an arid landscape. We do have a desert in Pakistan, Cholistan or Thar as it's called in Sindh, or Rajasthan as it's called in India, which is a moving, living desert actually. It's not just a place where there's sand, there's a dramatic ecosystem, shrublands, flora and fauna that grow. Then we tend to think of it, especially this year in Pakistan, Cholistan was a place where we were going to do irrigation because ye zameen banjar padi bhi thi and we have to use it, man has to conquer over it. But it's just a fascinating way of looking at this. I want to circle back to you, Chung, and speak, you spoke about the Irrawaddy, which is a river that flows, it's a transboundary river, flows through Myanmar. It starts in China, doesn't it? Oh, no, but my mistake. But it's a river ecology that you're dealing with, and you spoke about the vulnerability that Myanmar has, especially to weather events like cyclones and the monsoon, and you spoke about the need of having these effective early warning systems. But beyond that, can you speak to us about what sorts of community adaptation strategies will work for you or that you've worked with?
So thank you, Rafi. So in terms of the community adaptation strategies, there is not very technical communication adaptation strategies. Yeah, again, there is no a specific communication adaptation strategies. It's based on I think some of my panels highlighted, it's just based on the self-advocacy and based on the everyday lives. In addition to the just moving to other livelihoods or going to other towns, what was very minor things that they did, for example, tree management. Some villages started to remove the trees because the trees affected their house during the monsoon and the cyclone. Whereas some other villages started to build more trees to create a windbreak. And in terms of the shelter, not many villages have a very proper shelter, which is the key to allow people to feel safe and to be evacuated. So some villages started to designate shelter areas, which is mostly churches, monasteries, schools. And if there were some community centers, and that could be also as designated shelter areas. And in addition to just one more important thing is in terms of the more accessible early warning systems, some communities started to build their own early warning systems, which is, I think, I don't know whether Pakistan also has that. So we call some simple a flag color system. So depending on the impact of the storm, whether this is threatening, whether it is approaching Myanmar, whether this is coming within 12 hours or the threat pass, there will be different colors. And to highlight the intensity of the storm surges, they also use the number of the flags. So for example, if there are 2 red flags, which means it's very severe, it will reach to your region within 12 hours. I think, so going back to why it's important to think about the everyday level, I think Samantha mentioned about the microcredit and loans. It's very interesting that many of NGOs just come to the region. Oh, we are going to build the capacity. We are going to give this amount of money, but they do not really consult with the communities. So one of the example is, oh, these are the very sustainable seeds. You can grow and you can move to a different farming strategies. But actually, that seeds were very expensive and were not compatible with that motherlands. So this is just the tiny example. And in terms of the microcredit loan, it really affects women, especially. Those microcredit loans are mostly sometimes focusing on the buying the agriculture equipment. But in some communities, women are engaged in either selling coconut or as a merchant or as a involved in fishing community. So those loans specifically focusing on the agriculture would not speak to women, which is again going back to the climate justice. This is the program and the justice for whom. So sorry, I'm aware of the times.
Can I just ask a question?
Go right ahead.
I'm just fascinated about what you talked about, these community early warning systems. Can you just explain, for example, if we're in Lahore now and there's a storm coming from Karachi's direction, how would they let us know that it's coming and of what intensity? How does it work?
So I do not know much about the Lahore context, but in Myanmar, so basically there is information from the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology. And this information goes to the village disaster risk committee, and they are the communicating with the wider community.
Phone call.
Yeah. And also So sometimes they do work with communities to interpret what it means to them.
Oh, you mentioned red flags.
Yeah, flags. The more visual,
Got it.
So give me 2 more minutes. I just have a few more things to ask because I wanted to turn to Samanata. I know we didn't speak about this earlier, but this came to mind because you're working with innovation and technology in far-flung rural areas of Nepal, where living standards are almost untouched by modernity. Where does the money come from for innovation and technology in these areas? Do you find it a challenge?
An absolute challenge. Even when we talk about South Asia, Nepal comes at the bottom, because when we talk about foreign investments, they're also looking into returns, which means that Nepal, as a landlocked country, there's not much interest that we can really garner. So one of the challenges, or what I do, is really also around how do we cater to innovators who are working towards climate adaptation? How do we build fundings for them? How do we channel fundings into Nepal? And also talking about the rural communities, I think the early warning signal that Chung just mentioned, a lot of money flows into Nepal through remittance. We're losing, there's a lot of brain drain that is happening. We have a lot of people working in the Middle East. And actually, it's the migrant workers from Nepal who are keeping the economy afloat at the moment. And they are the largest contributors. However, there's a policy missing in terms of a dedicated policy. And I'm sure you all know that with the Gen Z uprising, the protest that recently happened, a lot of conversation about climate change really takes the back seat when stability becomes the priority of the nation. So this is something that's happening. But when we're talking about money channeling in, that's what we're really looking into. And in the ecosystem that I work in, the startup ecosystem, this is a fight. We call it a fight, a movement. Me and my colleague, there's one more person in my team. Each time we go to, let's say, a venture capitalist or a private equity firm, they're always talking about quick returns, but they're really not they're not interested in investing into climate innovation that actually caters to the need of the hour. They still think of it as a distant problem, which needs not
It's not crystallized as yet.
Not yet.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you.
Talking about finance, and I just want to make a climate justice finance point over here. That, look, climate change, or the issues of climate change, the way the world has responded to it has to be solved by international law. That's the system that we work in. The UN system, the COP system, whether you like it or not, that's the system that we have. Climate change is kind of like a genocide. It's a genocide of the human civilization. But if international law can't fix a genocide in Gaza, how is it going to fix it on scale around the world? You know, climate finance is something due to poor countries because capitalism and colonialism since the Industrial Revolution have denuded us of our natural resources and our wealth, making other countries rich. In 2010, there was a pledge to put $100 billion into a climate fund. It was called the Cancun Agreement in 2010. Right now, that fund lies at less than $15 billion of capitalization. That's 15 years later. Now I'm coming to your point because you were speaking so passionately about Gaza and the injustices that you see. Last year, the United States gave Ukraine and Israel $90 billion. One country, the whole climate finance in 1 year, and without loans. So there's money for genocide and for war, but there's no money to protect the lives and the properties of the billions of people in the global south. I know it's depressing to report on this, and you must see a lot of this injustice, but how often do you come across greenwashing? The lobbyists that seek to pollute the discourse with this. And okay, I'm sorry. 2 minutes.
drinking out of a plastic bottle. I'm drinking out of a plastic bottle at a climate conference. We've been taught to believe that this is convenient, it's cheap, it's reliable, it's clean, although we know there are microplastics in here. I'm ingesting them every time I take a sip. I mean, everything we do, from the clothes we wear, maybe not you. Some people up here do have on indigenous wear, but many of us do not. Seated here, we are wearing brand names: Levi's, Converse, Nike, Adidas, and so forth and so forth. And we've been so groomed to believe that these are super cool, and you want to be part of the in crowd, you wear them. And so even when companies then say we are playing our role, you can keep looking cool using our wear, but we are contributing to the environment. And we know those are lies. All the reports are coming out. BP, ExxonMobil, one of them. All of them. They always renege on their promises. No one is held accountable to these promises. Everything in the UN Paris Agreement, they say it's mandatory. It's not really mandatory. You can choose to do it. You can choose not to do it. I mean, the UN Security Council's power of veto power is one of the greatest evils on the planet. If the big five each of them can be allowed to just say, no, I don't want to do this, then the world is hostage. I mean, how do we get anywhere anymore? I'm just going to let you go on because I can go on forever.
Thank you for that. The UN system itself, it's the only one we have, and it's so frustratingly badly put together. I mean, you have a climate issue here, which is a civilizational challenge, and the best way we've done to resolve it is to cut the world into 200 different countries so that they can negotiate with each other. I mean, it's a suboptimal sort of way. Mijael, I'm so fascinated by your president. I have one more
Not
question.
myself.
I want to know what the political benefits are to being a climate denier.
Being a friend of Donald Trump, perhaps, for example. They have been together 2 weeks ago, so that's part of our context. Because, and you give me the point, we are the main debtor of the International Monetary Fund, Argentina. So, with that context, with that economical and financial crisis, of course it's more and more harder to speak about climate action, climate adaptation, and a lot of policies that they need money. The money we don't have, because the International Monetary Fund is asking every year, since I am a child, for money because we have to pay to them. If we have to pay to them, I put the question on the table, at least. Because that's part of the situation for many countries in the global south.
That's right.
So, part of my points, I know we are short of time, so I'm gonna make some bullet points, let's say. Latin American region, we are responsible for less than 8% of the global greenhouse emissions. We are more than 30 countries, less than 8%. So imagine that, and we are facing a lot of impacts because of climate change. In another hand, and we have been talking about this before the panel, I am really worried about the lack of democracy we are having. Many politicians and many trends in terms of authoritarian political leaders that are in different countries of Latin American region. For example, in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Argentina, and Peru, many others. I know that perhaps it's the first time you hear about these countries, and it's okay, but I think it's important to put it on the table because this lack of democracy we are having, I think it's not only in Latin America region, I think it's all over the world, and we have to talk about that because if not, it's impossible to talk about climate justice. We need to talk about the lack of democracy and what is going on in basic terms in all over the world, and mainly, and I finish with this, I want to deep into South-South cooperation because we are not having enough conversation of what are we going to do, because if we see, for example, the process of COP, of climate change, climate conference, we are not having enough and good results from there. So what are we going to do? We are gonna keep waiting results from COP30, for example? I mean, I have some hope, but I don't want to put all my hope in COP30 and this kind of process. And we have to build our hope between people.
I appreciate your point about democracy because we live in a region where we're losing 8 to 10 years of our life because of air pollution. And it's staggering that air pollution was not discussed during the 2023 elections in Punjab. this was a province where during the caretaker setup of the winter of 2023, over 500 children in Punjab alone died of pneumonia, which is a respiratory illness exacerbated by air pollution. And yet we don't talk about this because of the disruptions in our democracy, that interventions in our democracy. Sir, please, our guests have come from abroad. I really want to give them an opportunity to speak. I'm also limited by time, but I have a solution for you, sir. I do. I promise. I've taken your point. But we come back now to Selbi. A few minutes left. Can you explain to us what sort of reception your work has with the governments that you work with? Are they more or less accepting of your job, or do you find resistance in the work that you do? I know if you're uncomfortable
No,
answering that, I can understand that.
Actually, it's just, all right. I'm actually speaking tomorrow on another panel, so if we're running out of time, and I know many of my colleagues were still around here, and some are speaking on other panels, catch us and we can have a conversation.
Thank you.
Just because we have like 3 minutes, my work is embedded in what our government's agendas are, and my work is embedded in what communities have been co-creating. For me, reactionary has not been a way to do things. I find, just like climate change is deep time process, the dreaming is also this deep time process. Can we imagine life after us, like in, as we said, 7 generations, which is interesting because in Turkmenistan we have concept of 7 generations as our family. Like, for example, I myself know 8 generations behind me. And I learned that in Pacific Islanders, there's this idea of looking back while walking into the future. And while we walk into the future with our backs, it's much more sustainable, safer, because we know what was there in the past, and we don't know what is it in the future. For me, I actually just wanted to share my focus in the work is stewardship. Because the question in this panel was, where is the burden, who is responsibility, and often our communities are objectified into this category of vulnerable and victims. However, our communities, as I mentioned, thrived, existed, and sustained themselves and even other animals and other species and rivers and mountains in our areas. So in my art and science work, I focus on how rural people, especially farmers, pastoralists, herders, and including people who create artwork, and I think we discussed yesterday textiles. We discussed how actually to produce textiles we need to protect wild plants and herbs that we use, and we discussed insects that are used to produce particular color for that rugs that we make in Turkmenistan. So for me, our weavers, our artisans, our rural people, farmers, herders, actually hold the answers, and they're stewards of the sustainable future and stewards of our nature. So for me, is we don't only discuss those who are accountable for climate change, but also those who stewarding the heritage, both cultural and natural heritage that we have. And even more, I would add that when I started doing this work, I've realized that there are also positive impacts from these communities, that it's not only about preservation, but it's also about active contribution to ensuring the sustainable future that those communities hold. Like, for example, just last week, I was spending a night in the desert watching migratory birds. It's critically endangered sociable lapwing. It's a tiny wader, and it nests in Kazakhstan. There is an artwork that I collaboratively produced about this bird together with artisans and fellow artists from Central Eurasia. It was on Vienna. It's going to be next year in Germany, but also you can see it online. But basically, I was observing this bird that has never stopped over before on the border of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, but it started doing this stopover like a couple decades ago. this bird actually winters here in Pakistan. So for me, it was really kind of like magical that I will be also flying here. Of course, they have to fly over Hindu Kush. They have to fly over some of the tallest mountains in the world. So they need lots of energy. And one of the biggest stopovers they make is actually on this border. And scientists found it out when there were only 400 species left, and they were at the risk of extinction. They are still critically endangered. And scientists in Kazakhstan has put a device, and this is about technology. Yeah, so they put a device on one of the chicks, and they call them Maisa. And this chick, they noticed through satellite signal that the chick is hanging out somewhere in between of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan for quite a long time. It's on the Central Asian flyway. So this bird flies also to Sudan. So it has two ways, as African Eurasian flyway, and then Central Asian flyway from Kazakhstan all the way to Pakistan and India. And there's so many migratory birds like this, and actually most of these birds are indicators of the health of our ecosystems, and also indicators of sustainable relations between humans and other animals, what kind of multi-species relationship out there. So I was talking about one of the lead scientists also just like a couple of weeks ago before my trip, and he told me something that people do in India and Pakistan is amazing. The way how people have been making their rice paddies, although this bird has lost its immediate wildlife refuges, but the way how rice paddies are designed and taken care of makes this bird winter there. And even more, something that people on the border of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the way how Turkmen people have been taking care of soil on that side, and how Uzbek people built that one tiny water reservoir, made the whole population stop over there to get this energy. So for me, this is an example of coexistence that we can see into the future. So my focus is also how we do not, it's incredibly inspiring to see that our people who are at such a climate risk also making that important, meaningful contribution. So while not responsible,
on that
we also we contribute.
Very
to
poetic and somewhat optimistic note, feel that we've only scratched the surface of this conversation. It's only just getting exciting, but we have to clear out because there's another event, and I'll quickly ask you to please show your appreciation of our guests. I'm going to request our guests to hang outside on the steps for the next 5 to 10 minutes, please. Just sit on the steps, because I know there's some people who want to ask questions. So we'll give that opportunity to them. I really appreciate it. And let's make sure we get the next session off. Thank you very much.